Dr. Asha will be talking on a clinical and therapeutic approach to type 1 diabetes in adolescents and adults. It's a very important topic for us because the number of type 1 diabetic patients are becoming more and more. And we have good number of patients in the next decade will also become adults. So to this topic, we have Dr. Asha, who many of you may be knowing. She is a professor in Department of Endocrinology, Christian Medical College, Vellore. She has got a very brilliant academic background also. She was a gold medalist in MBBS and also two additional medals in MBBS subjects. Also, she had a Young Scholar Award in the year 2011 and Best Clinical Thesis in 2009 and also excellent clinical research work by the awarded by the British Endocrine Society. She has completed 2 projects, which is not a simple task. And now there are 6 more projects under her care. And she's an excellent teacher also, and also a dedicated healthcare provider. With not much of wasting time, I pass on the mic to Dr. Asha.
Thank you, Dr. Sudeep, for the kind introduction. After listening to the wide spectrum of various forms of diabetes in young, we move to the basic clinical topic in this discussion. This is about clinical and therapeutic approaches to type 1 diabetes. So we will cover when to suspect type 1 diabetes, how to confirm the diagnosis, how do we treat, and what are the barriers and challenges to the long-term care of these patients. So I would first start with a case. This is a 17-year-old girl, the common garden variety of patients whom you would see in the outpatient or in the emergency. So this was a 12th standard student who came to us 2 months after the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. She had lost about 19 kilos in weight at such a young age, and she had recurrent episodes of abdominal pain, vomiting, breathlessness, recurrent episodes of DKA and hypoglycemia requiring multiple hospital admissions. And though she was 17 years old, insulin was administered by her mother, and the needle was reused several times. And because of her diabetes, she found it difficult to cope with her studies. When she came to us, she had severe diabetic ketoacidosis, and further evaluation also confirmed the same. This is a girl with type 1 diabetes with severe DKA, recurrent episodes, and in addition, she had Graves' thyrotoxicosis as an associated autoimmune endocrinopathy, which had worsened the glucose fluctuations in this young girl. Coming to the various classifications of diabetes, this have been alluded to very much in detail in the previous presentation. So type 1 and type 2 diabetes are the most common forms of diabetes described in the various classifications. Type 1 diabetes is due to beta cell destruction leading to absolute insulin deficiency, which is classified as type 1A, which is immune mediated, or type 1B, which is idiopathic. Similarly, in the WHO classification, these two are the most common types described, followed by the other specific types which were discussed. So now coming to when to suspect type 1 diabetes when a young patient comes to you with diabetes. So when you have a child who is less than 10 years, more than 2 years of age, it is most likely to be type 1 diabetes. If a patient presents with diabetic ketoacidosis, again, the likelihood of type 1 diabetes is higher. DKA occurs at diagnosis in about 30% of patients with type 1 diabetes and in about 60 to 70% sometime during their lifetime. If a patient has associated weight loss or other autoimmune endocrinopathies, again, it favors a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. And as described earlier, if they lack the features of other forms of diabetes, like recurrent episodes of pancreatitis, deafness, myopathy, optic atrophy, or lipodystrophic features, then again, it would be easier to clinically classify them as type 1 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is the commonest cause of diabetes in children, presents with chronic hyperglycemia because of absolute insulin deficiency. The incidence varies from 4 to 10 cases per lakh per year in India. And the highest reported incidence is from the Scandinavian countries, where it is about 57 cases per lakh per year. The prevalence is progressively increasing at a rate of about 3% per annum, even in the younger age groups. So the classical hallmark is autoimmune destruction of the beta cells, leading to severe insulin deficiency, and insulin is absolutely essential to prevent ketosis and death. So if you are in doubt about the type of diabetes in a young person, especially, please do not delay the use of insulin. Definitely use insulin early, and later on, once the glycemic control is achieved, you can think about investigating for the other causes, other types of diabetes. Looking at the pathogenesis of type 1 diabetes, it starts with genetic predisposition, which is determined on the HLA haplotypes DR3, DR4, or DQ2, DQ8. In those genetically at risk, some environmental trigger, such as a viral infection, would trigger the positivity for autoantibodies. Autoantibodies do not per se destroy the beta cells, but they are a hallmark of T cell mediated beta cell destruction, which is insulitis. Over a period of time, this evolves from asymptomatic autoimmunity to progressive dysglycemia, and then development of frank diabetes with symptoms, and later on the occurrence of long-term complications if the diabetes is not controlled. So how do we confirm the diagnosis? So once we see a patient with type 1 diabetes, suspected, a young person with diabetes, you initiate insulin, achieve glycemic control, and later on you can do the other tests to confirm the diagnosis. So the diagnostic tests that would be helpful are to measure autoantibodies, which are directed towards the pancreatic islets. So the GAD65 antibodies and IA2 are the most commonly used. We also have the zinc transporter antibodies. Insulin autoantibodies are useful only if you're seeing them in the first 2 weeks after within diagnosis of diabetes. Later on, it is not a useful test. And of course, if you are suspecting a pancreatic diabetes, it is good to rule out pancreatic diabetes in people between the age group of 20 to 30 years who present with young onset diabetes. And C-peptide is a marker of endogenous insulin secretion, but remember, it should never be checked very early when a patient presents with DKA. So C-peptide levels should be checked only after achieving at least 2 weeks of stable glycemic control. So withhold the insulin for its time duration of action and measure the C-peptide post-meal. So we would like to see the maximum stimulated C-peptide, which occurs 90 minutes after a meal. And as per the DCCT criteria, a level more than 1.8 nanograms per ml indicates adequate beta cell reserve. Again, those with a post-meal C-peptide less than 3 have borderline insulin reserve, and you need to be cautious and monitor them very carefully. Coming to the autoantibodies, we have the data from a large type 1 diabetes genetics consortium dataset, which had about 5,000 individuals with type 1 diabetes, diagnosed at a median age of 10 years with at least 8 years of, with about an average of 8 years of follow-up. So in this data set, it was noticed that the highest prevalence of antibody positivity was in the age group of 8 to 13 years. So children who were diagnosed between the age of 8 to 13 had the highest antibody positivity, that is about 72%. And as the duration of diabetes increased, the antibodies disappeared over time. So from diagnosis to the first 5 years of diabetes, about 80% were antibody positive for any of the antibodies, that is either GAD antibody or IA2 antibodies. But when you look at patients who were checked after 14 years of diabetes, about 50% only were antibody positive. The important point to note is that even among those people who were treated as type 1 diabetes and who required insulin to control their blood glucose levels, about 20% of them did not have measurable diabetes associated autoantibodies. So autoantibodies are not the be all and end all. So you should depend on autoantibodies to confirm the diagnosis. But in the absence of antibodies, please do not discontinue insulin unless you have checked a C-peptide and confirmed endogenous insulin secretion. Also, some of the antibodies are related to the HLA haplotypes. The IA2 antibody is more seen in patients who have the HLA DR4 haplotypes, while DR3 and DR4 were both associated with the GAD antibodies. So in the age group of 8 to 13 years, IA2 was more common, while in older adults and in children older than 14 years, GAD antibodies were more common. And when it comes to how these antibodies behave over a period of time, and after more than 5 to 10 years of diagnosis, the antibody levels start falling, and even those who were antibody positive earlier can become antibody negative. And with increasing duration, the antibody positivity rate declines as well. These are various studies which have reported diabetes-associated autoantibodies among Indian patients, and the positivity for any antibody ranges between 47 to 97% across the various studies that have measured them. When we look at the various series, it is also obvious that the series which reported lower positivity rate about a decade earlier have now reported a higher positivity rate, indicating that the assays for the antibodies again are changing. And so the newer assays have better capacity for detection as compared to the older ones. Now coming to the treatment, insulin is absolutely essential for treatment. After the discovery of insulin in 1921, it has evolved through various stages where until the 1970s, there was a problem with the purification, and subsequently it has taken a huge leap with various designer and newer forms of insulin, which can mimic the normal physiology. The treatment with insulin should mimic the normal physiology. So wherein in the normal physiology, there is a basal rate of insulin secretion, and there are meal-related prandial peaks of insulin secretion. And when we treat a patient with type 1 diabetes, we should keep this physiology in mind and try to match our insulin regimen as close to the physiological state as possible, though it is a real big challenge. And so multiple daily injections are the only way to go about. So various forms of insulin are available now with varied properties that favor either a fast absorption and shorter duration of action to very long duration of action, even up to 42 hours. So when we look at the way insulin acts after it is injected, the common ones are the regular and the NPH insulin, which are shown in pink, and the others are the analogs. So the action profile of regular insulin, it is absorbed 30 to 60 minutes after injection, and the action lasts for 6 to 8 hours, while the rapid-acting insulin analogs start working within 5 to 15 minutes of injection, and their action gets over by 3 to 5 hours, which is the physiological way the food absorption of food and the utilization of glucose should occur. When it comes to intermediate and long-acting insulins, NPH action starts 2 to 4 hours after injection, and its action is over by 18 hours. And among the long-acting analogs, we have glargine, detemir, degludec. Degludec is the longest acting, which acts for 42 hours. Glargine, which was initially thought to be a peakless insulin, has been demonstrated to have a peak between 6 to 10 hours after injection, and its levels start dropping after 20 hours. So sometimes we may have to give twice daily glargine in patients with type 1 diabetes whose insulin secretory reserve is very poor. So while starting insulin therapy for a patient with type 1 diabetes, we should start with 0.4 to 0.5 units per kg per day. If a patient has been on insulin infusion for control of very high blood glucose levels, then you would take the total insulin requirement from the last day of infusion and give 40 to 50% of that as basal insulin, given either as a single injection of basal insulin analog or 2 injections of NPH, and you would give a prandial insulin, which is either regular insulin or one of the short-acting analogs, which is 50 to 60% of the total daily dose, which is divided according to the meals and also adjusted according to the carbohydrate content of the meals as well as the intended physical activity. The requirements of insulin are higher in obese individuals, those who are going through puberty, and those with sedentary lifestyles. This have to be kept in mind while adjusting their insulin regimens. Continuous subcutaneous insulin infusion pumps are an advancement in insulin therapy, which are programmable battery-operated devices which deliver short-acting or rapid-acting insulin as a continuous infusion through a catheter, which is placed in the subcutaneous tissue. It has the advantages that it offers greater flexibility of prandial boluses. It can accommodate for changes in insulin requirement according to exercise, especially in those who are involved in vigorous sports. It helps in managing early morning insulin resistance in pregnant individuals, and also avoids hypoglycemia, where the basal dose can be adjusted during periods of illness or fasting. It has been reported that insulin pump use, if done properly, is associated with less hypoglycemia as well as diabetic ketoacidosis, and HbA1c in these patients is about 0.3 to 0.6% lower than with multiple daily injections. But of course, there are problems as well, that you need a really motivated patient who is willing to monitor their glucose levels daily, because they are not visibly directly injecting their insulin. If their pump dysfunctions, they are at risk of diabetic ketoacidosis. So you cannot give an insulin pump for a patient who is not willing to monitor glucose levels daily. Also, they have to be taught about adjusting insulin for their carbohydrate as well as their insulin resistance, and they need extensive education in this regard. We now have the closed loop insulin pumps, which are being used in some countries. These are algorithm driven automated insulin delivery. So there is a method by which a sensor is fixed under the skin in order to measure the glucose levels constantly, and that information is conveyed to the pump, so that the pump then through the algorithm decides the insulin to be delivered. Again, here the basal doses are adjusted by the closed loop pumps, while the bolus doses have to be administered by the patient himself based on the amount of carbohydrate they are taking. Some of these algorithms also can incorporate the basal as well as the bolus dose calculators, and there the patient involvement is very less. The advantages of the closed loop pumps are you have a longer time in range of glucose levels, up to about 71% of the day, which is much more than the use of pumps alone without the closed loop setting, and a significant reduction in HbA1c with the use of these pumps. A further step advance is the dual hormone systems, where in addition to insulin, glucagon, amylin analogs or GLP-1 analogs are given as an infusion along with insulin, especially in those with hypoglycemia, unawareness or counter-regulatory hormone defects. Can we use some oral agents in type 1 diabetes? We can use, but that is only as an add-on therapy. Metformin as an add-on therapy has been suggested in patients with type 1 diabetes, and it has been shown to improve metabolic control in obese patients, poorly controlled adolescents and adults, and those requiring higher doses of insulin. A meta-analysis of 5 clinical trials showed that insulin use reduced on an average the insulin requirement by about 6 to 7 units per day. And also it improved the markers of cardiovascular risk, such as carotid intima media thickness, when it was used for longer durations along with insulin. The other oral agent which has been recently approved in the European countries and the UK are the sodium glucose cotransporter 2 inhibitors, that is the SGLT2 inhibitors. In a meta-analysis of 4,500 patients from 14 studies, addition of SGLT2 inhibitor significantly reduced the HbA1c by 0.4%, a fasting glucose by 20 milligrams, the body weight by 2.7 kgs, as well as a reduction of systolic blood pressure. The agents that are approved in the Europe are sotagliflozin and dapagliflozin. Even studies which used continuous glucose monitoring systems found that the glucose excursions were reduced with the addition of SGLT2 inhibitors without any significant increase in the risk of hypoglycemia or severe hypoglycemia. But the only problem is these agents are known to be associated with euglycemic ketosis, and hence there is an increased risk of diabetic ketoacidosis, as well as the glucose excretion increases the risk of genital tract infections. So one should not drastically reduce their insulin doses while on SGLT2 inhibitors in order to avoid this problem of DKA. So the guidelines, the NICE guidelines recommend addition of SGLT2 inhibitors in obese type 1 diabetes adults who require more than 0.5 units of insulin per kg body weight per day, and those who have completed a structured education program, that is, they are willing to monitor their blood ketone levels. In the UK, ketone meters are provided to all patients with type 1 diabetes. In India, urine dipstick monitoring may be an option. And these have to be monitored with periodic HbA1c monitoring. And if there is no significant reduction in HbA1c, they even suggest to withdraw the SGLT2 inhibitor. Now, coming to the most important aspect of long-term management of type 1 diabetes, diabetes education is the key, because these patients live with their diabetes for decades, and hence it is important for them to understand why they have diabetes, what is the treatment, and how they have to manage their diabetes in the long run. So at the initial visits, we have to concentrate on education about insulin self-administration, modification of their diet and physical activity, monitoring and maintaining a logbook, as well as recognition and management of hypoglycemia, and what to do when they are unwell. Coming to some of the practical aspects, our diabetes educators will be covering all these in their presentation. So we need to check the insulin injection sites during every clinic visit, and advise our patients to rotate the injection sites, not to use the needle too many times, because that increases the risk of scarring and lipohypertrophy. And appropriate storage of insulin is the key as well. Coming to medical nutrition therapy, most of these are youngsters, and so we cannot be very strict with our dietary advices to these patients, but we need to emphasize that their blood glucose levels depend on their food activity as well as their insulin doses. And hence it is not appropriate to just keep changing the insulin doses alone, but also be mindful of the food and physical activity and its impact on blood glucose levels. Also, in addition to carbohydrates, it is the composition of the meal where the protein, fat, and fiber also influence the way the glucose excursions happen. And most people find it difficult to adjust their insulin to the carbohydrate counting, and hence it is always best to advise a consistent carbohydrate intake at dinner in order to reduce the fluctuations at least for the 10 to 12 hours overnight. Carbohydrate counting definitely helps these patients have more flexibility with the kind of meals and snacks they can take, and thereby adjust their insulin accordingly. Physical activity is recommended even for type 1 diabetes, and all the guidelines recommend at least 60 minutes of regular physical activity every day, which is of moderate to vigorous intensity, and in addition, muscle and bone strengthening exercises at least 3 days per week. And during exercise, they have to maintain euglycemia, avoiding both hypo as well as hyperglycemic levels. And during an anticipated exercise, like a regular swimming class or a regular tennis class, they have to reduce the short-acting insulin before the exercise by 50 to 80%, and following exercise, reduce the long-acting insulin by 20%. If it is an unanticipated exercise which comes up suddenly, then they have to consume extra carbohydrate in order to have adequate energy for the activity. The most important aspect on long-term follow-up is appropriate glycemic monitoring. So these patients are advised to check their blood glucose levels at least 3 times before meals and at bedtime. And in their logbooks, in addition to recording their glucose levels and the insulin doses, we tell them to record the food they have eaten and also the timing of their physical activity in order to help them understand the impact of all these parameters on their glucose values. The targets for glycemic control are to achieve before meal targets of 80 to 130 and after meals and bedtime less than 180 milligrams per deciliter. A reasonable HbA1c target of less than 7.5% is advised, and lower goals can be suggested for patients who are well motivated and are able to achieve this without much hypoglycemia. And the goals definitely have to be individualized based on the benefit risk assessment. These patients have very, very minimal insulin reserve, and hence it is really difficult to achieve glycemic targets below 7.5. In our patients, we found that those who monitored at least 8 times per week had a better reduction in their HbA1c levels compared to those who monitored lesser. And the other better form of monitoring their glucose levels would be by using continuous glucose monitoring systems, where a small catheter containing glucose oxidase-based electrochemical sensor is inserted into the subcutaneous tissue, and that monitors their glucose levels in the interstitial fluid every 1 to 5 minutes, the results of which can be read on a reader. The advantage of a continuous glucose monitoring system are that the glucose profiles are checked through the day even while the patient is sleeping, and hence it is indicated in patients who have severe hypoglycemia or those with hypoglycemic unawareness, or where the hypoglycemia disturbs their day-to-day activities, and in those who are not getting controlled despite adequate treatment and testing. These are some of the CGMS records. This was the older continuous glucose monitor which we had, which we used to give the readings for 3 days. And we used to get the graphs of the proportion of time that was spent in euglycemia, hypo, as well as hyperglycemia. This gives an insight into the direction, magnitude, duration, and frequency of the glucose fluctuations. But a point to keep in mind is that there is a physiological lag of about 10 to 15 minutes before the sensor is able to read the changes in blood glucose. Now we have the flash glucose monitoring system, which gives the ambulatory glucose profile over 14 days. And in this, we get nice graphs as well as the actual glucose values of the glucose fluctuations through the day. And as you can make out here, we can make changes to therapy, which can be evident as we go through the patient records. Hypoglycemia is a major problem in managing patients with type 1 diabetes, because with whatever available technology, we still cannot mimic normal physiology. So the ADA has defined 3 levels of hypoglycemia, that is less than 70 milligrams per deciliter is level 1. Less than 54 is considered as level 2, when there is a risk of progressing to loss of consciousness soon, and one has to act very immediately. And severe hypoglycemia is classified as ADA level 3, where there is altered mental or physical status and the person needs assistance to manage their hypoglycemia. So there are various reasons for hypoglycemia, where the insulin, the nutrition, and the insulin sensitivity do not match the amount of insulin that is given, and hence there is either increased insulin sensitivity, decreased insulin clearance, or increased glucose utilization or decreased glucose delivery, any of these could lead on to hypoglycemia. The patients present with symptoms of autonomic activation, that is with tachycardia, sweating, palpitations, and tremors. In some patients, when they don't manage their hypoglycemia appropriately, there is blunting of the autonomic response, and that leads to behavioral abnormalities or seizures as the first manifestation. How do we treat hypoglycemia? It is treated with, in a conscious patient, you give 15 to 20 grams of carbohydrate, retest in 10 to 15 minutes, and give a meal or snack within 30 minutes. And in an unconscious or confused patient, you would give IV glucose or glucagon, and subsequently establish a continuous glucose infusion until the effect of the insulin, which is already injected, is over. These patients have to be educated about what they do when they're unwell. They should, most patients think that because they're not eating, they should not take insulin. An important word of caution is that they should never stop insulin altogether. They should monitor their blood glucose more frequently, take more oral fluids as sips, and also in case the glucose levels are not getting to control, they have to take extra doses of short-acting insulin. If they are vomiting or not able to eat well, they have to check their ketones as well and come to hospital if there is worsening sensorium or ketoacidosis. Abdominal pain is a common presentation in patients coming in with diabetic ketoacidosis, and this is due to impaired gut motility due to the acute hyperglycemia. But also we need to keep in mind that it may be a sign of mesenteric ischemia, pancreatitis, hepatitis, or pyelonephritis, which have to be investigated if the pain persists even after correcting the DKA. In the ongoing care of these patients, it's important to monitor the growth and puberty of children. Blood pressure monitoring should be done at every visit, and at every visit, we have to check for injection sites to look for lipohypertrophy. HbA1c should be checked every 3 to 6 months, and also we should screen them for complications of diabetes. The screening for microvascular complications would begin about 3 to 5 years after diagnosis of diabetes and after the age of 10 to 11 years, while screening for macrovascular disease usually begins after puberty. And if a person has normal cholesterol levels, then periodic screening every 3 years. Blood pressure to be checked at every clinic visit, and foot care in Indian patients, we have to check during every visit. Because type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder, it is associated with other autoimmune conditions, and primary hypothyroidism is the most common autoimmune disorder associated with type 1 diabetes. So TPO antibodies and TSH should be checked after achieving metabolic control. When a person comes with DKA, please don't check their thyroid functions. They will have a sick euthyroid syndrome, and hence it can give rise to a false diagnosis of hypothyroidism. So check for hypothyroidism after achieving metabolic control for at least 1 to 2 weeks. And subsequently, if it is normal, check TSH every 1 to 2 yearly. The other autoimmune endocrinopathies are less common, that is hyperthyroidism, celiac disease, Addison's. You check for those conditions only if they have symptoms. Though the guidelines recommend routine screening for celiac disease, we don't see that so much in South India, but it's definitely a problem in Northern India. Though type 1 diabetes occurs in the young, it is also a cardiovascular risk factor because of the prolonged hyperglycemia itself, leading to generation of the advanced glycation end products, lipid peroxidation, generation of atherogenic LDL, and the systemic inflammation, leading to endothelial dysfunction and atherosclerosis. Hence, it's important to use the risk calculators or assess the clinical risk based on family history, presence of dyslipidemia and associated nephropathy or hypertension. And based on that, monitor their blood pressure levels and treat appropriately when the blood pressure is more than 140/90 and to target to levels of about 130/80. ACE inhibitors or ARBs are the first line treatments that have been advised. As discussed, there is an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and hence statin therapy has been shown to reduce cardiovascular events in patients with type 1 diabetes. Both the NICE and the ADA guidelines recommend using statins in those above the age of 40 years with type 1 diabetes for more than 10 years, and those with additional cardiovascular risk factors or nephropathy. These youngsters, especially the women, we have to be careful when they go through pregnancy, because in a large database which compared women with type 1 diabetes versus normal women, there was an increased risk of congenital malformations, preterm delivery, perinatal mortality, as well as large for gestational age in pregnancies in mothers with type 1 diabetes. And hence it is important to achieve good glycemic control before they plan a pregnancy, and aim for HbA1c as close to normal as possible. Stop ACE inhibitors, ARBs or statins before planning pregnancy, and start them on folic acid to avoid the neural tube defects. And during pregnancy, we would closely monitor their blood glucose levels before and 1 hour after meals, and have more tighter targets. During pregnancy, there is also a risk of worsening of diabetic retinopathy as well as gastroparesis, and proteinuria increases the risk of preeclampsia. All these have to be kept in mind and treated appropriately based on the situation of the patient. The vaccinations for type 1 diabetes are the same as that for type 2 diabetes. The recommendations are to give the routine vaccination with hepatitis B, influenza every yearly, then pneumococcal polysaccharide vaccine, and the tetanus vaccine, especially in pregnancy. A word about beta cell restorative therapies. The pancreas kidney transplantation, pancreas alone transplantation, or islet alone transplantation are options to restore functioning beta cells in these patients. But we have to keep in mind the risk of immunosuppression, long-term immunosuppression, which itself can be detrimental to these patients. Now, studies are ongoing to look at newer therapies like encapsulated islets or porcine islet xenograft. Studies are ongoing, and these are not yet available. These patients with type 1 diabetes, they are very young when they are diagnosed, and most often they feel isolated in the society. There are various myths that this is a curse, they are not fit to study or work, and women with type 1 diabetes cannot have children. These are the myths that exist in the society. And in addition, they have a huge financial burden due to the cost of insulin, the glucometers, strips. They find it difficult to share about their diabetes with their peers in school, etc. They feel ashamed to take insulin in public. There is difficulty in getting jobs, and many people lose their jobs because of hypoglycemia at workplaces. So hence, it's important to sensitize the family and the society about what the individual is going through, and get a support system which will help them manage their diabetes better. In addition, adolescents go through various physiological and psychological changes, problems with eating disorders, their emerging independence and confidence, which are all major hindrances to diabetes management in this age group. So the idea of the International Diabetes Federation Life for a Child program has helped overcome some of the financial burden by providing free glucometers, insulin and strips, and especially they have been very generous in providing support to our patients during the COVID pandemic, when many of the youngsters lost their jobs, and some of the youngsters found it difficult to buy insulin because their parents did not have jobs. And they also provide education bulletins, which helps improve the quality of care of these patients. So when it comes to the younger people with type 1 diabetes, it is the peer support which has a major say in helping them manage and cope with their diabetes better. In addition, the peer group sessions can also be used as an opportunity for structured diabetes education, providing them the skills of diabetes self-management, and help them get on to shared decision making. So these are some of the support groups. These are children from the United States, which have who have formed the Pen Pals United and various support groups from other parts of India, which keeps our patients motivated and cope with their diabetes better. And social support and also structured diabetes education involving their families definitely help improve the glycemic control. And this is what we saw in our patients during our analysis. So that's all, and thank you for patient listening.
Thank you, Asha, for the wonderful presentation, very elaborate and had given in detail about many aspects of managing type 1 diabetes in youngsters. We'll now go through questions. I'll combine a few of them. Like there is one question which asks about the CGM. What's the variation expected? I think they are asking a question about the difference expected between the venous and the capillary. I think they meant the interstitial glucose. What is the expected difference between the two? When you're going to have a venous blood and a measurement of a CGM.
Yeah. So in a fasting state, that is during steady state, the difference is about 20 to 30 milligrams per deciliter. The interstitial glucose is lower than the capillary glucose. But in a postprandial state, definitely there is a lot of flux which is happening between the capillaries and the interstitium. And so the difference will be much higher in a fed state, especially within the first 2 hours after feeding.
Is there a comparison between the venous blood also? Venous blood and the values what we get in the interstitial measurement?
It is almost about 30 to 35% different. That's the change.
Okay. Second, a continuation of this, will it be enough to pick up all unrecognized hypoglycemias with just a 7 to 14 day CGM?
Of course, you cannot pick up all the hypoglycemias with 7 to 14 days, but at least to start with, if you do a one sitting of 7 to 14 days, then you know where these problems are happening and what could be the reasons. Then you can identify and rectify those factors, thereby reducing the incidence of hypoglycemia.
The other thing about the dietary thing, is there any reference for practitioners to get some useful tips about the carbohydrate counting? And any few examples you can give for healthy snacks?
Okay. So with regard to carbohydrate counting, now various books are available online. I think the Dr. Mohan's Diabetes Center have a book which is available online to help count carbohydrates. But the best way to actually do it is to measure the food. That is, have a weighing scale and actually measure the quantity of food and then cross-check with the references given in the books. It's also available online, and various apps are available now, like Healthify Me, where you can enter the food which you are taking, and that will give a value of the carbohydrate content of those foods. With regard to healthy snacks, pulses, then nuts, and maybe eggs. These are some healthy snacks which can be routinely consumed by patients with type 1 diabetes.
So the next question is about the GAD antibodies. I'll combine two questions together. One is GAD antibody test important for all LADAs? And second part is, how much is a false positivity and negativity of GAD65 in type 1?
GAD in type 1, false positivities are less, but false negatives maybe are more. That is what we observe as we look at various studies that have reported GAD antibodies over a period of time. So there is a study from SGPGI which was reported in 2012-13, where they found that 45% of their patients were antibody positive, and in a recent study from the same institution report a higher antibody positivity with a different assay. So more likely that some patients were labeled as antibody negative earlier with the earlier assay. So with better assays, we are more likely to pick up higher antibody positivity in type 1 diabetes. But again, please keep the clinical context in mind that if a person is requiring insulin and has very high glucose excursions on withdrawing insulin even for a short duration, we should not depend on antibodies alone, and we have to make a clinical judgment about the type of diabetes.
About LADA?
Yeah, again for LADA, it is a useful marker for diagnosis, but as I alluded to in type 1 diabetes, the longer the duration of diabetes, the less likely you're going to pick up antibody positivity. So if somebody developed LADA, say 5 years ago, and now we are checking antibodies, we are likely to find it negative even in about 40% of those patients. Hence, we need to keep the duration of diabetes in mind while interpreting the antibodies.
This is one of the delegates' clinical problem case. It's a 13-year-old boy with diabetes mellitus who was having very poor control, requiring 20 to 25 units of insulin 3 to 4 times a day. And a few weeks ago, he started developing hypoglycemic episodes, and gradually the insulin has been tapered down to 2 to 3 units of rapid-acting analog before meals and 1 to 2 units of glargine. And still his values are fluctuating between 60 to 550. They have made attempts to rule out Somogyi and Down's phenomenon. And also the fasting and the postprandial insulin levels have been less than 1. The cortisol has been within the normal limits. So the delegate wants to know what else can be done and how can we achieve a better outcome in this particular patient.
Yeah,
I think for the sudden change in the insulin requirement.
See, one possibility is if it is a newly diagnosed diabetes, initially they require a large amount of insulin, and once we achieve a steady state of glycemic control over a period of time in the first 6 to 8 months, their insulin requirements may actually come down. But here the insulin requirements have come down from 30 to 2 to 3 units, so which is a very drastic decline. Honeymoon phase of type 1 diabetes is one possibility. The other possibility is development of lipohypertrophy at insulin injection sites where insulin is getting erratically absorbed. And so that may be leading to wide fluctuations because the insulin, probably they would have measured the C-peptide, which was found to be low. And despite that, the patient's glucose levels are fluctuating between 60 to 500. But we also need to remember that there are occasional patients who have very brittle kind of diabetes. And so that may also be the reason, especially in an adolescent where their eating behaviors are unpredictable. So that would be another reason for this problem. And you have appropriately checked the cortisol levels. So adrenal insufficiency is another possibility which you think of when a person has low glucose levels.
Okay, only time will tell them. The more closer monitoring is required for this particular case.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, other question is the common possible complications in a controlled type 1 diabetes. I think we may have to see this question in two aspects. One is immediate complication and long term. What are the common possible complications in a controlled type 1 diabetes? I think maybe experience from a long-term follow-up of a cohort of type 1, if you're having, then the experience will be much better.
Yeah. So what do we define as control is the biggest question here. A normal HbA1c alone doesn't mean good control in type 1 diabetes because that would have been an average of hypo and hyperglycemic excursions. So in addition to assessing their HbA1c periodically, we need to have a close watch on their glucose logbooks and if possible, do some CGM at least once in a year in order to understand the glucose fluctuations. So glucose variability is also linked very much to the complications of diabetes and hence in a patient with diabetes, in addition to the long-term monitoring, we also need to look at the short-term glucose fluctuations in order to understand its impact on long-term complications. And patients who are well controlled are less likely to have complications, but probably at this point in time, we can't say that they will not develop the long-term micro or macrovascular complications. Coming to the acute problems, those are the hypoglycemia and the DKA. In a well-controlled diabetes, these are less likely. But even in well-controlled diabetics, what we see commonly is they would have about 2 hypoglycemias per week. And most often, people who are well-controlled manage them appropriately. 1 or 2 episodes of hypoglycemia per week is a commonality in all patients who have well-controlled diabetes, type 1.
Fine. I think we'll go for the last question. I'll combine 2 questions. What is your experience or CMC's experience in using metformin or SGLT2 inhibitors in type 1 diabetes, particularly in obese type 1 diabetes? Is there experience there? And what does the literature tell? You can make it a very short reply.
Yeah, I have already presented what the literature says. So I will just add on by saying that we have been using metformin over the last decade for obese patients with type 1 diabetes, and definitely it helps in reducing their insulin requirements, say by 5 to 6 units. Most important than that is it causes some degree of weight reduction, at least about 3 to 4 kgs, which helps improve their insulin sensitivity. Some people who have developed diabetes at a very young age tend to become obese as they become adults, and their insulin requirements are also higher. This can be managed well with metformin. SGLT2 inhibitors, the problem is the prohibitive cost, and so we have not used much in type 1 diabetes, though we have used in a few patients and found that it helps achieve a little smoother, a better glucose profile through the day with reduced fluctuations.
Sure. I think we'll stop here, and we can try to take the remaining questions if time permits. I pass on the mic to Dr. Philip for the next session. Thank you, Asha.